I've heard the term thrown about quite a bit, borrowing from the reserves. Are you allowed to do that if you have an emergency?
Yes. However, there is a very specific procedure that must be followed. And at this point in time, it's really important to be aware of what this entails with our current, concern about possibly more delinquencies. Honestly, I'm not hearing a lot about increases in delinquencies, coming personally to me. They've got to be out there. We're doing a huge amount of reserve studies. And honestly, when the whole shutdown happened with COVID, we were concerned that people were going to say, I don't care what the law says, we're not doing a reserve study this year because we're going to take that money and pay for our gardener, pay for our maintenance of our hallways, whatever it is. That did not turn out to be the case. Fortunately, I'm glad to at least have observed that from my perspective. But there were PPP loans and things like that happening, keeping people afloat, the unemployment insurance, the supplemental unemployment insurance. So there still could be a situation where, we're at the end of all these lifelines, and now people are having hardships paying. So borrowing from reserves, if they are healthy, is definitely a recommendable thing to do if you follow the guidelines. But you just need to know, first of all, it involves intent to consider the transfer, the borrowing in a board meeting notice. So that's your first step. The notice needs to include the reasons of the transfer, options for repayment, and whether a special assessment may be considered, which in practical reality, special assessment is usually going to happen. The borrowing can last up to a year before you have to pay it back, with certain minor exceptions, and the board can delay it. So just to go through those steps and document it, it really makes a lot of sense. If an association is experiencing temporary financial hardship, if it's a result of keeping their monthly assessments and the reserve contributions artificially low, in my opinion, that is not a valid reason. It's not saying you can't do it, but that's somewhat robbing Peter to pay Paul, as far as I'm concerned. Point being is that you're going to have to pay it back. There is no gift from the government, from anybody. If you borrow from reserves, that is a technique. And if you have available cash, you don't have to go get a loan. You can literally transfer the money with your bank, your financial institution.
What Les described was California law. There's different law regulating borrowing in other states.
Right. Okay. Right. That is all California.
But I want to reinforce the point that Les made. Reserves are designated funds. They're there for specific purposes. They're there to help the association have enough cash so you can replace the roof, paint the building, all those kinds of things. The reserve funds are designated for a specific purpose. It's not a slush fund, not a rainy day fund. And so, again, as Les said, if you borrow from it, the intent is the law is going to force the board to have you reimburse the reserve fund. The board can't just look at it and say, wow, we have $500,000 in reserves. How come we're having such a hard time paying, as Les said, the landscaper? Well, the whole point is you've got a $750,000 roof project in 3 years. So you got to slap the hand that wants to reach into that. So be real careful. Whether it's controlled by state law in any particular state, if you need to borrow from reserves at this time for an emergency, you better have a plan to replace it before it's needed by the reserve fund.